Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is John Capucci. I'm the interim principal of Assumption University and the Stephen Jaroslavsky Chair in Religion and Conflict. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. In particular, I would like to welcome our partner for this event, the Windsor Islamic Association. Imam Yusuf Wab, who should be here very shortly, has kindly partnered with us on this event. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to provide a brief background on her academic achievements. Dr. Ingrid Mattson is a Muslim religious leader, a scholar of Islamic studies, and an expert in interfaith relations. Since 2002, she has held the London and Windsor Community Chair in Islamic Studies at Huron University College at Western University in London. Just before completing her PhD from the University of Chicago, and I should note that is quite a prestigious university, Dr. Mattson was named Professor of Islamic Studies at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut, where she developed and directed the first accredited graduate program for Muslim chaplains in America. She also served as the director for the McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. From 2001 to 2010, she served as vice president and then as president of the Islamic Society of North America, and she was the first woman to serve in that position. In that position, she established an Office of Interfaith and Community Engagement in Washington, D.C., and facilitated new partnerships with Christian and Jewish communities. Her writings, both academic and public, focus primarily on Quran interpretation, Islamic theological ethics, and interfaith relations. Her book, The Story of the Quran, is an academic bestseller and was distributed to libraries across the United States by the United States National Endowment for the Humanities. She is a recipient of numerous awards as well as a few honorary doctorates from Trinity College in Hartford, the Chicago Theological Seminary, and of course the University of Waterloo. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ingrid Mattson.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for facilitating my visit here to Windsor today. I'm just going to pop this back up, and also thank you to the Imam Yusuf is here. Is it the Islamic Association of Windsor?
Windsor Islamic Association.
Okay, all right. So for all those who helped get me here today, you'll see that Windsor is in my name. It confuses people sometimes. They think I teach here, but what it means is that the community members in Windsor as well as in London fundraised for the chair that brought me back to Canada, back to my home and native land of Canada, just in time, I must say. Very happy after couple decades in the United States to be back in Canada. And I feel there's a lot of blessing actually in this chair, because almost all of my other colleagues who have chairs in Islamic studies in North America have their chair named after a billionaire playboy or a corrupt king or some kind of. So I'm very, very lucky that this was a community initiative, and that it was an initiative not only of Muslim community members but our friends in the interfaith community. So I really do feel that it is just such an honor to be able to be in this position and be able to engage with both teach students and also engage with communities in southern Ontario, southwestern Ontario. Today I have a topic. My topic is framing Muslim women, narratives and counter-narratives from scripture and tradition. And I know that there's some people in this audience gathered today who might know a lot about some of the topics we'll be looking at today. Others, maybe this is an introduction to Islam. Sooner or later, someone's going to get lost or object, and that's just fine. We'll have some time for questions at the end, as long as I keep an eye on the time. And I'm going to say, John, just stand up and wave me down if I'm going too long. I know that sunset is a bit after 7:30, and so there's going to be probably some Muslim community members who might need to go out and pray the sunset prayer at a certain time before we completely finish, or might be able to hang in there till the end. So come and go as you wish, and please take note of your questions. So I'm really looking at the issue of framing, because as we know, none of us are blank slates. Our minds are not blank slates, and we can never truly say that we don't know anything about something. We always are interpreting the world through our experiences, through what we've been taught, what we've been told, how events have been presented to us. It's a challenge to, it's very easy to say, I have an open mind, or I want to have an open mind. But of course, we all have cognitive barriers to really learning and engaging, because almost everything, and certainly when it comes to encountering people of other faiths or cultures or backgrounds, we have already been exposed to certain perceptions of them or framings of them. And there's a well-known cognitive barrier to learning called the anchoring effect, which says that when we're introduced to a new topic, that the way that that topic is introduced to us serves as the sort of filter for any other new information that will come later. And we'll always be comparing new information to that first time we learned about something or heard about something, and it will make us either skeptical, very skeptical of it, and demand some kind of proof, or just simply might make it a little bit more difficult for us to expand our knowledge. So this is how, even things like a lot of people are talking about race and racism right now, and this is why it isn't simply about having good intention or bad intentions, or whether we're racist or not racist. It's that through our lives we're exposed to images and biases and stereotypes and stories that create these cognitive filters for how we understand something. And as much as we want to be those, that open-minded person, it can be difficult, and it does take effort. But that is the moral imperative for all of us, right? Even though it is difficult, we know that as human beings we do have these weaknesses, and we have capacities that are expressed through our history and through our exposure to events. And so we can either just say, well, that's how I am, or we can say, I have a moral obligation to understand that I'm seeing the world through a certain perspective, and now I need to deal with that and maybe push myself a little further. And that goes for all of us, because in this talk today, I'm talking about frames that are imposed on the Islamic tradition, but also that emerge within the Islamic tradition by Muslim scholars themselves, by the Muslim commentators themselves, when they discuss women, women as a category of people. So we have the same struggle within our own tradition that may be between us and those who are outside of our tradition, and really trying to look at things anew and realizing that we've all been shaped by perception. So I really want to begin here with the story of Abraham. Often people talk about Islam, Christianity, Judaism as Abrahamic traditions, and I'm looking in particular at the story of Abraham's family and his two wives, or his wife and his concubine, or however they might be described. So in Genesis, this is a section from Genesis that talks about Hagar, or Hajar as she is called in the Islamic tradition. So from Genesis, it reads, "Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hajar or Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. How many of you are familiar with this story? Yes, most people? Okay. So we have, I want you to hold on to some essential points of the story here. What happened to Hagar, and then what happened later. Let's see. This, and here is a classical portrait that portrays this sending off of Hagar and her child by the prophet Abraham. You see the woman with the back turned is Sarah. Now, this story is also told by the Prophet Muhammad to his followers. And this is captured in what's called an authentic or verified report that the Prophet Muhammad told this story in this way. So let me read it to you, and I want you to take note of where the similarities and differences are. Abraham brought her, meaning Hajar, and her son Ismail, or Ishmael, Ismail is the Arabic way of saying that name, well, she was suckling him, to a place near the Kaaba, under a tree on the spot of Zamzam, at the highest place in the masjid, the place where people pray, mosque, masjid. During those days, there was nobody in Mecca, nor was there any water. So he made them sit over there and placed them near a leather bag containing some dates and a small skin containing some water, and set out homeward. Ismail's mother followed him, saying, "O Abraham, where are you going, leaving us in this valley where there is no person whose company we may enjoy, nor is there anything here?" She repeated that to him many times, but he did not look back at her. Then she asked him, "Has God ordered you to do this?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then he will not neglect us," and returned while Abraham proceeded onward. And on reaching the Thania, where they could not see him, he faced the Kaaba and raising both hands invoked God, saying the following prayers: "O our Lord, I have made some of my offspring dwell in the valley without cultivation. By your sacred house in order, O our Lord, that they may offer prayer perfectly. So fill the hearts of people with love towards them, and provide them with fruits so that they may give thanks." So, stage one. Next stage. Back to Hajar. As we see Abraham leaving, we turn the camera back to Hajar. Ismail's mother went on suckling Ismail and drinking from the water she had. When the water in the water skin had all been used up, she became thirsty, and her child also became thirsty. She watched him tossing in agony, and she left him, for she could not endure looking at him, and found that the mountain of Safa was the nearest mountain to her on that land. She stood on it and started looking at the valley keenly, so that she might see somebody, but she could not see anybody. Then she descended from Safa, and when she reached the valley, she tucked up her robe and ran in the valley like a person making a great effort, until she crossed the valley and reached the Marwa mountain, where she stood and kept looking, expecting to see somebody, but she could not see anybody. She repeated that, running back and forth between Safa and Marwa 7 times. The Prophet Muhammad said, this is the source of the tradition of the people running the mountains of Safa and Marwa. And I will get back to that in a minute. The story goes on and says that while she was then, after she ran back and forth, making this effort, going to the tops of the mountains because she's looking to see, is there anyone out there? because she has declared that God will not abandon them. And so the most likely way for them to be saved is that someone's coming along with more water, right? And when you want to see if someone's coming, go to the highest place. But shortly after, she heard the angel speak to her, and she saw under the foot of her baby on the ground, the well springing up, the well of Zamzam. And the water flowed, and it kept flowing. And after that time, after the water kept flowing, and they were saved, and they were able to drink, some Bedouin travelers at a distance noticed some birds flying above that area, and they said, wait, that's very strange. Those birds would not fly above any place except where there's water, and we know there's no water there. So they went to check it out, and they found Hajar and her baby there just chilling out by that well, water flowing. And they said, this is extraordinary. Can we settle with you? Can we come and stay with you? And she said, yes, but I'm in charge of the water. And later the story goes on that her son grew up and he married a girl from that tribe, and then they were the ancestors of the Arab people. The Arab people who continued to live in that place, follow some of the rites of Abraham, but also introduce elements of idolatry into their worship, until the Prophet Muhammad was sent by God to tell them to return back to the original message of Abraham, which is to break the idols and to worship the one God, the one creator, the God of all humanity. So what do we notice? I'm just going to let's see, a hand or two. What are some differences in these two stories? Key differences when it comes to Hajar herself. Yes?
I don't understand that. In the beginning, in Genesis, Abraham was supposed to be in Israel or Palestine or that there. And then to get from there to Mecca is one heck of a distance. I've been in that area, and for somebody to get from there to Mecca is...
Well, actually, there
was divine interference to drop her off there.
Right. Okay, so that's one difference, but that's not the point of this. But let's remember that Abraham began in Ur, which is in Iraq, and that he went as far as Egypt. Yeah. Right?
Yes.
And that he also then went as far as Sham, or the greater Syria. So actually, Mecca is not that any greater distance than any of those distances that he took. But let's leave that aside. These are two narratives that come out of different oral traditions that begin at some source and branch off. But what about Hajar herself, the character of Hajar? What do you notice about her? Amin?
But the incredible thing about when Abraham told her that this is from God, her trusting God, saying that if he had ordered you, he'll take care of us. And her worries were gone. She knew that God's help would be coming, and that's why she was running between the two hills to see where is the help coming from and how, either there's water or people are coming with water.
Right. So in the Genesis story, she's so upset she sits down and cries. She stays in that place, and until God brings the miracle and God opened her eyes, she's just there. In the Arabian and then Islamic version of the story, she is very active. She has absolute trust in God. She knows she's going to be saved, but she doesn't know how. She never imagined that an angel would be sent to her and open this. So she's a very active character in the second. Also, if you notice that before Abraham heads out, she's questioning him. She's not just left there and is like, oh well, starts crying and sitting, but she questions him, and she keeps questioning him until he answers her and is able to say, look, is this just you're doing this to me? You've abandoned me as a husband? Or is this some, as a prophet, Abraham was a prophet, is this a message that you've received from God? And when he says it's from God, then she has the trust. So she's questioning her husband, And then when she knows that she has been ordered by God to be in this place, then she trusts in God and goes about very actively, trying to figure out, well, where's this miracle or this help going to come from? And then when it does happen and people come, she is generous, she is hospitable, but she keeps in charge and in control of the water. Right? So she is a true matriarch in a spiritual sense, because it's because of her faith and her trust in God that this place becomes habitable. She is a matriarch in the sense of in the political sense. She has power. To control the water is to have power, and she insists on that because she trusts in her own capacity to be just with this limited resource. So it's really tremendous. And then, as we mentioned in the narrative, the Prophet Muhammad, as he's telling the story, is saying to his followers, this is why when we make the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the pilgrimage to Mecca has many different stations. So some of them involve making circles around the Kaaba, praying and worshiping God. And one of them, another stage, is running between these two mountains. They're not like big mountains, they're more like hills. So running back and forth, like she did, and your pilgrimage is not complete. The Hajj, or the pilgrimage that every Muslim has to make once in their lifetime, is not complete and is not, you have not fulfilled your obligation until you run in the footsteps of Hajar. So she has founded, by her actions, she is the founding mother of one of the obligatory acts of worship in Islam. Now, the point is not who's right, who's wrong. These are two different scriptural traditions. But it does tell us something about perspective and telling one's own story. Because in the biblical tradition, the children of Hajar are not part of the story after. I mean, there is a little bit sort of coming back, and the two sons bury Abraham together. But then they're cut out of the story. And there's a shift later to the descendants of the children of Israel. And so the story that's being told is about a branch of the family that, well numerous, and it's according to God's command that they become a great people. And it's interesting that in the biblical story, Hajar's real legacy is the fact that she has many children. So the emphasis is on her motherhood, right? She's the mother of these people. Whereas in the Islamic tradition, yes, she's a mother of a prophet, and she's the mother of these people, but she's also the founder of the city. She's the founder of an obligatory act of worship. So she's much more than that. She's not just this motherly figure. So who gets to tell the story about, their own story? This is a challenge that Muslim women have had in Canadian society, in societies where they are minorities, where the story about them, who they are, what their actions mean or symbolize, what their community, what their place in the community is often being told by others. And it's not that people are necessarily biased in a deliberate way, but these stories have been introduced, or these perspectives have been introduced to people in different ways. It could be a biblical story, but it could also be the Orientalist tradition of portrait painting in the 19th century. The Romantics who would paint these harems with all of these sort of titillating images of women in the Ottoman Empire. Or it could be images that are coming through the news that are true images about women being oppressed or suppressed. It happens definitely in parts of the Muslim world. it's not the whole story. I mean, news focuses on what is upsetting, what is exceptional, what is violent, right? The news does not show us normal everyday life, or, hey, here's a bunch of people in another country just sitting around living their lives, chatting with their families, playing with their children, and enjoying, you know, all of the good things of life like everyone else. So this is the challenge that we all have when we are trying to understand a community that's not our own, especially a community that is a minority, is that we have very limited images, and we're all subject to bias and stereotypes because of that. And so that's why it's important to go back and have a look. And so just back to the story of Hajar, we have, this is a photograph of the well of Zamzam from which people drink until today. So it is a spring in Mecca. This is a recent picture of the pilgrims who are running back and forth. So the whole circuit is now enclosed by these buildings for the sake of managing the flow of traffic. Because today, you know, ever since we've had modern transportation and people are able to fly all over the world, there's a real challenge during the pilgrimage of managing so many people. So there are often over 3 million people who come there, whereas in the 19th century you may have, what, 10,000 people or 20,000 people. So it's a real you know, challenge for the flow of people. Well, what's quite interesting is that when you go there today, and I went with my husband, and we went, and I felt really moved by this, all the different parts of the pilgrimage, but this part had a special resonance for me because I had at that time a daughter who was very, very sick, and just, you know, thinking about how Hajar felt about her child, feeling the same, you know, wanting my child to be saved, and just running in her footsteps. You know, you've got to keep going, you've got to keep trying, and just being so moved by that. And my husband and I doing this together, and then we came up on the sign because, of course, Mecca is now in a nation state of Saudi Arabia. Okay. Mecca wasn't always in Saudi Arabia. Mecca has always been in the Arabian Peninsula, but it was governed by, over the centuries, by many different governments. So for about 500 years, the government that controlled it was the Ottoman Empire. And it's only in the less than the last 100 years that this new, you know, ruling tribe came, the Saudi family, and established their own nation state, and now control this, and in their own very peculiar and particular way created regulations for how people should live in this country. They're quite different than what existed before. But as we were running back and forth, there's a sign there. I don't know if it's still there because we went about 10 years ago, but a sign said that this is where people should start running. It's sort of like you walk and then you get to the sort of fast part of the hill and you run. And there was a sign that said, "But women don't run." Is that sign still there? Has anyone been there recently? Is it still there? Okay.
No.
No? Not this year?
There's a sign that's where you run, but there's nothing about the woman.
Okay, so they took that down, but someone said she saw it recently.
It maybe wasn't a sign, it was a little bold where it said women don't run, because you never saw women running, there was only men.
So in a book, or your guide told you?
It was kind of like, even when we went there, women didn't run.
Okay, so it depends when you go. When I went there, there literally was a sign that said women don't run. And I remember, you know, turning to my husband and saying to him, "Isn't this strange that we're doing this in imitation of a woman?" Grabbed my hand and we both just started running. And we ran it and no one stopped us. Now, what's interesting, and this is where I want to shift, to say that for many women Muslim women, the story of Hajar is a very empowering story. It is a remarkable story. She really is to us, our spiritual matriarch, a founder of the religion, a woman to emphasize and to imitate in terms of her faith and her strength and her ability, her insistence on distinguishing between what her husband might tell her to do and what religion might tell her to do, what God might tell her, and saying, well, they're not the same thing. Just because my husband's saying it doesn't mean it's necessarily the right thing. I have a right to say, well, where is this coming from? And that she has this generosity, she has this strength, that she has this enduring legacy that everyone follows. So it's not only women that run, men and women run, and this is we're doing it for the sake of God, but we're following really in her footsteps. Yet, the tradition can then get interpreted through all different forms of culture, heritage, practice, and bias, even within, even among Muslims ourselves. And so this is the shift now that I would like to turn to, that we go from sort of the external gaze, where Hajar is a story is told about Hajar that is very different than the story that comes out of her heirs, her descendants, to within the Islamic tradition, where we find that, if you look at, say, pamphlets or opinions written by Muslim scholars about this issue, they'll make a lot of different kind of rationalizations. So I've seen people say, well, it's because women or men are strong and women aren't. And I wasn't going to expose you to all of these opinions, or an opinion that says, well, it's because if a woman runs, she might like expose part of her body, and it's really important that she retains her modesty in this setting. And it's quite interesting, because when we look at that, what we see is that there is a strain within the Islamic tradition that picks up this idea that there is there's a kind of almost ideal woman that emerges, which is a sort of delicate woman. And it's interesting because you can look at something like this is a 10th century legal manual, and it's filled with templates for different kinds of contracts. So it's really for a student. It's like a textbook to learn how to write contracts. And the first contract that's in this textbook from the 10th century is a marriage contract. And so it gives, this is when, a father marries his previously unmarried daughter. And so in each, there are all these spaces where you fill in the name of the person, the name of the father, the name of the bride, the name of the groom, what her marriage gift would be, etc., etc. And then it's interesting because there's a spot here where it talks about, and know, so this is a quote from the contract, and know that so-and-so, this woman, is the kind of woman who doesn't serve herself, but she's served by others. And so part of the obligation of the husband is to provide her with either the money or the servant, so that she doesn't have to serve herself. So it's this kind of ideal of a woman who is, a kind of upper class woman who has the right to be served. What's very interesting is that you find that many of the classical legal books of Islam were written in the areas that were heirs to the Roman Empire. And so you have a kind of stereotypical woman that emerges in these legal books that is like that upper class Roman woman. The one whose husband can afford to have other people serve her. So she has a spacious home, and she's generous, and she is very hospitable to guests, but it's other people who are serving her. And you know, sometimes, I mean, that sounds like a really nice life, but it can also get flipped in the way that what is simply an offer of support for someone who wants it can become an expectation that is incapacitating. So that then the ideal becomes a woman who really does not do these other things, and it can create barriers so that she really does not develop the capacities that perhaps she has to be able to do these other forms of activity and work. And I mean, if you do your own housework, you are going to be in better shape than if you don't. You're going to be stronger. So a kind of like, is this a weak woman or not? And that's certainly not the intention, but it's a little bit about unintended consequences. And then the question is, and this is why we can never look at gender without looking at class in any society, well, who are serving this woman? Who are the servants? Well, they're other women, right? So what about those women? What about their work? And who is writing the rules for them? And the reality is that you do find a sensitive discussion of them in the tradition, but it's not these sort of theoretical manuals. It's in the narratives, it's in the specific legal opinions, but you have to dig in it. And when people are looking back historically, sometimes they make the mistake of only looking at a certain kind of text to come out with this stereotypical view of a woman. The reality is that throughout Islamic history and Muslim societies in the past and in the present, the vast majority of women have had to work. And they still do, and they do difficult manual labor. The majority of Muslim women in history were farmers, or agriculturalists, or hunters, gatherers, nomads. The nomadic women, they had to, pack up the tents and load them up on camels, and it's a very physically difficult job. This is a woman from Iran. This is a woman from Morocco. All these pictures are in the last 10 years, right? This is a woman from Mali. These are women from Niger. I love this, wow, like that's a really strong woman. That is a woman from Indonesia who's carrying a huge, gigantic bag of rice. So the vast majority of women have worked, and they've worked outside, and they've done really hard work. And let's have a look at their clothes. They were able to do this work wearing, this woman has a baby on her back, okay? Like, I just want to really say what kind of hero this woman is. But they're not wearing a uniform. They're wearing clothes that are covering their body, but they're also getting the job done, right? So it's not that there's this one thing that is the most important thing that should interfere with everything else. That, well, if their clothes, if they have to roll up their sleeves, or, they have to do a little work here that somehow they can't do it. They have to do it. They have to do it to survive. And that is the vast majority of women. And so what I want to say is that who is historically the Muslim woman, and what do we know, even in Muslim society today, what do we know about the reality? And I want to talk now about colonized Islam. This gentleman is Lord Cromer, Evelyn Baring, who was the viceroy during the English colonial occupation of much of the Middle East, was in charge of Egypt and the Sudan. When he came to the Middle East, he talked a lot about how Islam oppresses Muslim women. The British were there to liberate Muslim women. And when he arrived in Cairo, he found that there was a medical school, a woman's medical school, Egyptian woman's medical school. Lord Cromer was a Victorian, And he thought that this was outrageous, that weak women would be exposed to things like surgery. And so he actually closed down the Women's Medical College, created a nursing school for women so that they could do something more suitable to their delicate constitutions. Lord Cromer, meanwhile, was busy at home as the founder and president of the Anti-Suffrage Society, meaning that while he was advocating for the so-called liberation of women in Muslim countries, at home he was advocating to and trying to stop English women from getting the vote. That's the Anti-Suffrage Society. This Anti-Suffrage Society drew on the most grotesque stereotypes of women to try to deny them the vote. So just a sample of posters, anti-suffrage posters from that time. The woman, the poster at the top is to show that, well, it's only ugly women who can't get husbands who are advocating for the vote. The bottom, you see, it says, find the head of the household. So the man is hiding behind something. So the idea is that it's only emasculated men, not real men, who would allow their wives to advocate for the vote. And of course, our old favorite, that the woman who's grabbing the man and kissing him, it's cut out, the statement's cut out, it said, the easy way for women to get the vote. So the idea that women are using their sexuality to get their vote. So this is what the Anti-Suffrage Society was propagating in terms of what is a real woman and a real man and what is not. And this is one of the anti-suffrage posters, women's sphere is in the home. Now, Muslims have lived a post-colonial Islam for 200 years. And this is something that I noticed with my students, is that much of what they consider to be tradition is actually post-colonial Islam. Our ideas about gender, about women and men, about society that are not traditional in the sense of just arising out of the majority of the Islamic tradition, but follow out of the colonization of the Muslim world and the ideals of the European colonialists. With colonization, one of the very devastating things that happened is that in order to extract the goods of the societies that they were occupying, because, I mean, you colonize a society because you want the stuff there, right? You want the fields, you want nowadays it's oil or minerals or things like that. In that time, it was to be able to grow cotton and wheat and other things. And studies, many studies have shown that in all of the central Muslim majority lands around the Mediterranean, that in most places 50% of arable land, so land that could be cultivated, was dedicated to charitable causes. So these agricultural fields and produce, the profit went to support schools, mosques, shelters for homeless people, etc. Anything that was a good cause. And because of that, that was the legal designation. It couldn't be sold. You know, so if you're coming into a land because you're like, oh wow, I could grow a lot of wheat here, and now 50% of the fields are dedicated for charitable purposes, that's a problem. That's a barrier to so-called progress, right? And so little by little, these endowments, which are called al-Qaf, were taken over by the colonialists. People were accused, well, they're not really managing them well. They don't really make the land very productive. We know how to make it more productive, etc. And took over these lands. What happened to the charities that were being supported, or the nonprofits, the schools, the mosques, the shelters, the orphans' homes, they lost their source of income as well. And part of this story is that many studies have been done looking at the legal documents and court documents, especially in the Ottoman Empire, of these charitable endowments. And all across the Mediterranean, in every place, at least half of these charitable endowments were run by women. So every charitable endowment has to have a director, like an executive director or managing director. And all across the Mediterranean, all across the majority Muslim lands, 50% of those directors were women. Gave them a salary, it gave them a public position. They had to hire the workers, they had to manage it, they had to manage the accounts, they had to make sure that the money that money kept flowing in, and it was paid out to the dedicated charity. After that, everything became nationalized. Once so-called independence came in, these things were not put back into civil society or an independent sector, but they became under the Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs or Islamic Affairs of the government, and people were hired as government employees to be in those positions. So what happened in colonized Islam is there suddenly emerged a division between private and public space that did not exist before. The idea of public space is a modern conception, and a dichotomy between public and private space is a completely modern idea. It doesn't mean there's not a difference between private space, you know, the private space of the home or something that is private. But in terms of outside society, the idea that there's a public space and that's where, you know, the government does things and all these things happen, and then women's place, like the anti-suffrage poster said, women's place is in the home, is a 19th century European conception that came to the Muslim world. And so women were removed from these public positions. They no longer had a place. And time passes and people think that that's the way it's always been. And it becomes rationalized. You know, people rationalize the surrounding. Oh, well, women, it must be because women are not very good at managing things or not very good at managing business, or it would be too difficult for them or something like this. Whereas historically, that is simply not the case. It's just a rationalization of the post-colonial reality. And we're going to end in 10 minutes so that then people can take time to pray, or if they need to go before then, that's fine as well. This is one of the, one of the ways of framing women, that women are part of, you know, the private sphere, men are in the public sphere, that we've had to overcome within our own tradition because of the post-colonial reality. And we're going back and discovering all of the places like the Qarawiyyin, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world in Fez, Morocco, which was founded by a woman, very pious woman. And like so many other great historical institutions in the Muslim world. And then there's been research that's been done on not only women as founders and managers of the charitable sector, but also as scholars. And so this is a book that came out recently, a great traditionalist scholar who studies historical manuscripts, who had been raised in India with this idea of public and private space, and that the place for women is in private space, and that they take care of the home and the children, and they're pious and they engage in prayer, but really their sphere is domestic, and that the men's sphere is the public sphere. He had been raised that way, Sheikh Muhammad Akram Nadawi. But then he started working through manuscripts, and he found, and he summarizes his results in this book called Al-Muhaddithat, the Women Scholars of Hadith, is that as he went through historical manuscripts from 200, 400, 500 years ago, he started finding women everywhere. Women as teachers of classes, women as students in classes, women teaching in mosques, women teaching in universities. And it was completely contrary to his view as someone who had grown up in post-colonial India of where Muslim women were in society. And it's a really remarkable book. He has just one example of an anecdote that he gives is in the first century of Islam, which is in the 7th century of the Common Era. He gives an anecdote about a great woman named al-Darda who's teaching in the mosque in Jerusalem, and she has all sorts of students, and the Caliph king, Abdul Malik, who's the king of the Caliph of the Umayyad Empire, comes and sits in her study circle and learns from her. And then when the time for prayer comes, he goes and he gives her his arm, because by this point she's elderly, and she leans on him and she helps him get up, or he helps her get up so that she can pray. They all pray together, and then she goes back teaching the class in this very public space. And so that's just one anecdote, and it always takes my students some time to kind of adjust their minds to this reality, because we still, don't really have that full sense of what our history really is. Not to reproduce it, but to accurately reflect it and say where we're going now. And it's not just it's not this kind of like Western idea or liberal idea. This is a beautiful documentary that came out last year, the year before, about the first woman judge in the religious court in Palestine, Khulud al-Faqih. It's a very moving documentary about how she went and she did her own master's research, it was her own master's research on women judges in Islamic history. She brought it to the head of the head judge and said, look, this is what I wrote. There's no reason why there shouldn't be women judges. He read it and he said, you're right. And he allowed women to sit for the exam. And along with Judge Khulud, another woman was admitted. They were the first 2 women judges in the Palestinian religious courts. And it's very moving because you see how not everyone welcomed it, and you see the kind of stereotypes that are brought up by sometimes her colleagues and other people in the court. Yet she's just a vision of strength and piety and determination. I'll just skip with some things and say, just go back to the idea of women running. Now, what is the Muslim woman today, or what is her? Well, there are all sorts of Muslim women. I mean, there's what, 600 million Muslim women in the world, all different cultures and backgrounds and aspirations and ways they want to live. But there are certainly lots of women who are saying, I can be modest and I can run, I can be active. This woman was on the U.S. fencing team for the last Olympics and won a silver medal. Mary Matar, who was in the 2012 Olympics, a runner. Women basketball players. Nike just came out with a Toronto Raptors hijab, sports hijab, basketball hijab, because there's so many women who play basketball. So just to sum up, what does all of this mean? And I'd like to bring it in closing to our reality today, sort of, going back to the external gaze and the internal gaze and the way we might frame Muslim women. As you know, the current government of Quebec decided to invoke the notwithstanding clause of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to justify and support a law that bans government employees from wearing so-called religious symbols in those positions. So if you're a teacher or a lawyer or a social worker in Quebec, you cannot wear so-called religious symbols. But the question is, what is a religious symbol? And this is really a question of framing and classification. How many of you have heard of Aristotle? So Aristotle is very famous for being one of the first who created a taxonomy system for creatures. So he organized all living things in a certain taxonomy. And it's a key part of the classical heritage and philosophy to classify things. It is what every bureaucrat does in every administration or department. What category does this fit in so that I can tax it, so that I can apply a law to it? Is it this or is it that? The right to classify or to categorize or to put things in a taxonomy is not a neutral power, it's not a neutral act, it's not an objective act. To say that a head covering is a religious symbol, like a ring or like another piece of jewelry, is a choice. For Muslim women who cover their heads, and I can't speak for other religious traditions, I can't speak for Sikhs or for Jews who cover their head, but for Muslim women, the headscarf is both is part of a religious, done out of religious sentiment and obligation, but it is also a piece of clothing. Okay? It is also a piece of clothing. So if we recategorize the headscarf as clothing and said the government is ordering that women remove this clothing in order to be in a certain position, in any other context that would be outrageous. For example, that any woman who wanted to be a teacher would have to wear a sleeveless shirt, couldn't cover her arms, right? We would say, like, you don't have a right to tell me whether that I should uncover my arms, or that they should wear a skirt that only goes to their knees and not longer. And so the right to frame an issue is tremendously powerful. It is not an objective act, and I hope that what I've shown through this brief kind of run, like Hajar, through Islamic history and culture and society and different issues, is that we need to be more thoughtful about how we frame the other when we talk to them, and really have the opportunity to let them frame themselves, explain themselves, and really present themselves according to the categories and stories that they themselves understand. So thank you for your attention, and we'll stop here for right now.